In an instant, heart-stopping moment, Flora Walters' world unraveled like a thread pulled from a tightly wound seam. 1 second she was raising her wineglass, its crystal facets catching the chandelier's golden glow in their opulent Chicago penthouse. The next, her eyes locked onto the gold pendant swaying just below Vanessa's collarbone. It was a delicate crescent moon, etched with a single, bone-chilling initial, L, glinting like a phantom summoned from a past she'd buried deep. Her pulse thundered, her breath snagged in her throat, the room fading to a blur. 15-year-old Ben Walter, his face radiant with unguarded pride, stood beside her, utterly unaware of the storm breaking in his mother's heart as he introduced the girl he'd brought into their pristine, high-rise sanctuary. "Mom, Dad, this is Vanessa." Vanessa's soft smile held a quiet confidence, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension that clung to the dining room like damp air. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. Walter." Flora didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the necklace, her pulse hammering in her ears. Alex Walter, seated at the head of the polished mahogany table, cleared his throat, his tie slightly loosened after a long day. "And how did you two meet?" he asked, his voice warm but cautious. "At the Lincoln shelter," Ben answered quickly, his enthusiasm filling the silence. "She teaches coding to younger kids. That's where I volunteer." "Amazing," Alex murmured, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Flora blinked at last, her fingers trembling as she set her untouched glass down. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cold, brittle as frost. "I'll be back in a moment." She rose stiffly, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, one hand instinctively reaching for the necklace hidden beneath her silk blouse. Something was very, very wrong, and the weight of it pressed against her chest like a stone. Flora didn't stop until she reached the master suite, her sanctuary of muted grays and soft linens. She shut the door, locked it with a click, and approached the antique jewelry box on her dresser, her hands shaking as if they belonged to someone else. Buried beneath a tangle of pearls and diamonds was a necklace nearly identical to Vanessa's, a gold crescent moon etched with the same solitary L. She hadn't touched it in nearly 19 years, yet its weight felt as heavy as the guilt she'd carried since that rain-soaked night. Downstairs, the dining room's atmosphere had thinned, but the tension lingered like a held breath. Vanessa sipped water from a crystal glass, her dark eyes scanning the room's opulence with quiet curiosity. Ben rambled to fill the silence, his voice bright but nervous. "She's into AI and robotics, too, Mom. I mean, she's applying to Cornell, and she's already built this insane algorithm for." Alex raised an eyebrow, his interest genuine but guarded. "Impressive." Vanessa nodded, tucking a braid behind her ear. "I've always loved solving puzzles. It's like cracking a code the universe wrote." Alex offered a small, polite smile, but his gaze drifted back to her necklace, its faint gleam catching the candlelight. "That's a beautiful piece. Family heirloom." Vanessa's fingers brushed the pendant. "Actually, no. I don't know where it came from." "You don't?" "I grew up in foster care. The necklace was the only thing found with me as a baby." The room fell silent, the clink of silverware stilled. Alex glanced toward the empty doorway where Flora had vanished, his jaw tightening. Vanessa didn't notice, her eyes fixed on the charm, unaware it had just pried open a door the Walters had bolted shut long ago. Flora stood at the bathroom sink, the cold water running over her wrists doing little to steady her ragged breath. She hadn't thought about that night in years, the relentless rain, the piercing screams, the decision she and her family swore to bury forever. Now, a girl sat at her dining table, wearing that necklace, unraveling a past Flora had tried to outrun. She gripped the marble counter, her reflection in the mirror pale and haunted, fighting to stay upright. Downstairs, Ben was oblivious, caught up in Vanessa's soft, nervous laughter as she recounted a story about one of her coding students accidentally programming a robot to spin in wild circles. "It just wouldn't stop," she said, her grin infectious despite the room's weight. "We had to unplug the whole panel before it crashed into a wall." Alex chuckled, but his mind was elsewhere, spinning through memories of a hospital room, a blood-soaked blanket, and that same crescent moon necklace glinting under harsh fluorescent lights. Footsteps echoed from the hall, sharp and deliberate. Flora returned, her composure as cold and fragile as porcelain. She took her seat, her smile tight, her eyes avoiding Vanessa's. "Sorry, just needed to check a message," she said, her voice clipped. "Everything okay?" Ben asked, his brow furrowing. "Of course," Flora replied, but her tone was hollow. Then she turned to Vanessa, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Have you ever tried to trace your birth parents?" Vanessa's face fell, her fingers tightening around her glass. She hesitated. "I used to," she whispered. "But I stopped when someone warned me to let it go." The silence was suffocating, pressing against Ben's ribs. "Someone warned you?" he asked, leaning forward, his voice edged with concern. Vanessa nodded, her eyes distant. "Yeah, about 2 years ago. I filed a request for non-identifying records. A week later, I got a typed note in the mail. No return address, just one sentence." "What did it say?" Alex asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Vanessa glanced between them, her throat tight. It said, "Stop digging. Some graves are sealed for a reason." Flora's knuckles whitened around her wine glass, the stem trembling in her grip. "And you just stopped?" she asked, her casual tone betrayed by the strain in her eyes. "I was 14. It scared me," Vanessa admitted, looking away, her voice tinged with embarrassment. "I figured maybe my parents were dangerous or powerful, so I let it go. I told myself the past didn't matter." Ben reached for her hand under the table, his touch gentle but firm. "It matters," he said softly. Alex cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "You said the necklace came with you as a baby. Do you still have any of the paperwork from the system?" Vanessa blinked, startled. "Only a copy. Why? Would you be willing to let us see it?" he asked too quickly, his voice betraying urgency. Flora shot him a sharp look, but Vanessa just shrugged, her expression wary but open. "Sure. It's at my apartment." Flora's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I want to see it tonight." An hour later, on June 12, 2024, Ben pulled up outside Vanessa's modest apartment in a quiet corner of Southside Chicago, the city's skyline a distant shimmer against the evening haze. The contrast was stark, from the Walters penthouse with its soaring ceilings to Vanessa's creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. Flora and Alex had insisted on coming, their silence in the car heavy with unspoken questions. Flora claimed she wanted clarity, but her rigid posture suggested fear. Alex said nothing, his eyes fixed on the road. Vanessa apologized for the mess as they entered, though her small studio was immaculate. Books stacked neatly on a shelf, a thriving potted plant on the windowsill catching the last of the dusk, and an old laptop charging on a desk cobbled together from wooden crates. "It's in here," she said, kneeling to retrieve a slim manila folder from a fireproof box under her bed. "It's not much, just intake notes and a faded medical report." She handed it to Flora, whose fingers trembled as she opened it. The top page was a hospital report. Female, infant, African American, approximately 6 days, found abandoned near Lincoln Park shelter, wearing crescent moon necklace. No injuries, no witnesses. Flora's breath caught, a sharp gasp she couldn't hide. Beneath it was a social worker's note dated June 17, 2006. Infant appeared healthy. Anonymous caller reported location. Caller's voice, female, mid-30s, possibly educated, refused to give a name, said, "She's safer without me." Alex stepped back, his face paling as if struck. Flora sank onto the edge of Vanessa's couch, her eyes unblinking, whispering, "Oh my God, it was you." Ben's head snapped between them, confusion knitting his brow. "Wait, what do you mean, Mom? What's going on?" Flora didn't answer, her gaze locked on the folder as if it had summoned a ghost from the depths of her soul. Vanessa stood frozen, one hand gripping the edge of her desk, her knuckles taut. "You recognize this, don't you?" Alex asked quietly, his eyes not on Vanessa but on his wife, searching her face for answers. Flora's voice cracked, low and raw. "That necklace, it's not just similar. It's the same. I had one just like it made years ago." She stopped, her breath hitching. "Before what?" Ben demanded, rising, panic clawing at his throat. Alex's voice was barely a whisper, heavy with dread. Before the baby. Vanessa's lips parted, stunned. What baby? Flora stood too fast, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't the time. This isn't the place. Vanessa stepped back, her voice trembling but firm. I think I have the right to know. Flora turned to her son, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Ben, she may be your sister. The silence was crushing, unforgiving. No, Vanessa whispered, retreating as if slapped. That's not possible. But Flora didn't deny it. Alex sank onto a chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders hunched. Ben stood frozen, the world tilting beneath him. No, he said again, louder, his voice cracking. That can't be right. That's insane. Vanessa backed into the corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest, holding herself together by sheer will. Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Flora remained silent, her face a mask of anguish, as if she'd aged a decade in minutes. I was 21, she said at last, her voice barely audible. I was in college, unmarried, unready. My parents threatened to disown me if I kept the baby. So I made the worst decision of my life. She looked at Vanessa, her eyes pleading. They told me you were adopted. I didn't know where you ended up. But I couldn't bear the thought of you having nothing. So I left the necklace. It was all I had. Vanessa's voice was icy, cutting. You abandoned me. I hated myself every day for it, Flora whispered, her voice breaking. Ben turned to his mother, his tone hollow. And you never told me. Alex finally spoke, his voice brittle as dry leaves. I found out 3 years after we married. She told me in tears. I promised never to bring it up again. But she's not your daughter, Flora said softly. She's mine but not ours. Alex's question hung in the air, heavy with dread. Are you sure? The next morning, June 13, 2024, was oppressively quiet. Vanessa hadn't slept, sitting on her bed, knees drawn to her chest, clutching the necklace she once thought was merely a trinket. Her world had unraveled in a single evening, leaving her adrift, unsure who to trust, least of all herself. A sharp knock at her door jolted her. It was Ben alone, his eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. He held out a small envelope, his hand unsteady. A private DNA lab. They'll come to you. No records, no publicity, no drama. Vanessa stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. You still think I might be your sister? She asked, her voice soft but laced with fear. I don't know what to think, Ben admitted, his voice raw. But I want the truth. Whatever it is, she said, taking the envelope with a trembling hand. Back at the Walter penthouse, Flora sat at the dining table, her untouched coffee cold, her eyes distant. Alex paced, phone in hand, his footsteps a restless rhythm. She hates me, Flora whispered, her voice barely audible. I saw it in her eyes. She's allowed to, Alex replied, his tone gentle but firm. But that doesn't mean this ends in hate. Hours later, the DNA technician arrived at Vanessa's apartment, their visit brief and clinical. 4 days later, on June 17, 2024, an email landed in Vanessa's inbox. She opened it slowly, her heart thundering. The results read, 99.8% probability of a direct maternal relationship to Flora Walter. Below that, no paternal match to Alex Walter. Flora stood alone on the rooftop garden of Walter Tower, the Chicago skyline sprawling beneath a twilight sky. She clutched the original crescent moon necklace, hidden for 19 years, its weight a reminder of her choices. The DNA results confirmed what her heart already knew, but Alex's lack of paternity shifted everything, stirring questions she wasn't ready to face. I failed her twice, she whispered to the wind. Once when I gave her away, and again when I met her and saw only my shame. Footsteps crunched softly behind her. Vanessa appeared, her expression guarded but soft. You wanted to meet? She said gently. So I came. Flora turned, her voice cracking like thin ice. Thank you. They sat on a bench beneath a glass awning, the city's hum a distant pulse. I wasn't going to come, Vanessa admitted, her braid catching the evening breeze. But I kept thinking about what you asked that first night. About the necklace. And about my parents. I used to want answers. Now I just want peace. Flora reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was the twin necklace. I had two made, she said, her voice thick. One for me, one for the baby I thought I'd never see again. Vanessa stared at it, then met Flora's eyes. I don't need it to know who I am, she whispered. But I'll wear it to remember who you chose to become. On September 22, 2024, the Walter Foundation announced a new scholarship initiative for young women in foster care pursuing tech education. It bore no family name, instead called the Vanessa Lane Initiative, a quiet tribute to resilience. At the press launch, Flora stood beside Vanessa, not as a benefactor but as a mother stepping into a role she'd long abandoned. Ben took the podium, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. She's not my sister by blood, he said, glancing at Vanessa with a smile, but I'd be proud if she was. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause, the sound washing over them like a tide. Later, in a quiet corner of the Foundation's new mentorship wing, Vanessa knelt beside a shy 13-year-old girl, guiding her through a tangled circuit that refused to light up. Flora watched from the hallway, her eyes wet but unwavering, the ache in her chest softening. Alex stood beside her, his hand brushing hers. She's not your mistake, he said softly. She is your miracle. Flora didn't respond, she didn't need to. Vanessa now wore both necklaces, hers and the one Flora had kept, not as relics of pain but as emblems of a past reclaimed and a future redefined. She hadn't just found a family, she had forged one, piece by painful piece. Sometimes the most powerful connections aren't born in blood but fought for in the quiet moments of courage and choice.